I recognize the member from Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I am very glad to be able to start my remarks as the official opposition critic for infrastructure, transportation and highways as we are discussing here at third reading the Moving Ontarians More Safely Act, or the MOMS Act, Bill 282. And Speaker, I will tell you, this is my very first opportunity as critic to speak to this bill in this House. Interestingly, when it was first introduced, it was introduced in such a rush that because we're cohorting, I was not here or able, and it passed through within days to committee, which is a bit frustrating when we do want to take the time to be thoughtful. And as we saw at committee, there was a lot to talk about that came from the community, fine-tuning, some concerns that were raised. And I will take the opportunity later this afternoon, as I look at the clock, that I think the bulk of my 1 hour lead is going to be later today, and I am going to take the opportunity to share a number of those specific concerns. This is a bill that makes changes to the Highway Traffic Act. We've spoken at length in this House and across our communities about the need to address stunt driving in a thoughtful way, in an effective way. We did hear some folks at committee both grateful that we're moving forward on this, but also, again, with some suggestions that are maybe more for regulation and for the government to consider as they are moving forward on that. So I hope that they will take that into consideration. But also a lot of safety pieces that we talk about, that we want to crack down on folks who are breaking the law, that we want to have either stiffer penalties, or we want to have more prevention when it comes to the education side. I think about the successful Mothers Against Drunk Driving campaigns that we all grew up with about, the need or about drunk driving, the perils of that. And I think that there's conversation to be had around what stunt driving education campaigns look like, about the dangers. So again, we had fantastic input at committee, and I think beforehand, folks like MAD have really worked hard to keep our roads safer on this issue and others. Speaker, there are issues in here, of course, about dooring. We've talked about dooring, and we brought some thoughtful amendments to committee that were defeated, unfortunately, but I don't think that the dooring conversation, I don't think we've closed the door on the dooring conversation, because as we are starting to track those collisions, I won't call them accidents because it's preventable, and as we are tracking that and being thoughtful, hopefully we realize that the amendments that were brought forward, as suggested by community and the NDP tabled amendments, hopefully the government will reverse course and actually bring those, adopt those. There was a lot of talk, and I actually think that the government was surprised by, and they can correct me, but I think they were surprised by the backlash or the reaction from the e-bike using community, the e-bike enthusiasts. Because I think, if I'm being generous, Speaker, and I cannot impugn motive, so I have no idea what the government was thinking, but I did believe the minister when she came to committee and said that the government's intent, and she's repeated today, the government's intent was to support e-bike use across communities. However, what we've heard from retailers, from folks in families, businesses and grandmas that are using their e-bikes or cargo bikes and whatnot, that they are very concerned that now those bikes will be deemed illegal because of some of the technical pieces of this bill. And I'm telling you, I was not an e-bike expert before this bill got tabled on that Monday morning, 2 weeks ago. I was not. I don't have one. I don't, I don't know. I do now. Wow. Really, not just a vocal group, an educated group that they know and love their e-bikes, and certainly those who are connected to the industry, whether they're looking to import new bikes that meet the needs of communities and business and tourism, or whether they're retailers who are connecting folks with the power-assisted support that they need to get around as they age. like my colleague from Ottawa was suggesting, he's right on the cusp there. However, Speaker, their concerns are legitimate. As we get into the nitty-gritty of the bill and the technical pieces, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, about weight of the e-bike itself, or whether it's the gross vehicle weight, or if it's just the bike alone. The government is out of step with other jurisdictions. They're out of step with international standards. I don't know what this is going to look like now. And people, now that this bill has passed to third reading, we can't amend it again. We had that chance at committee. We were able to amend it. The government chose not to amend any part of it. And there were, well, I guess it would be a prop if I were to show you all of my amendments. But these are all of the amendments, Speaker. And none of them passed. And they were thoughtful, and they were based on experts. They weren't just, that the member from Oshawa decided she had better ideas about e-bikes. No, she didn't. No, I've had to learn that. So, Speaker, we're going to get into it this afternoon, kind of amendment by amendment, and I know that the e-bike community are quite eager to kind of to hear what it is that was suggested. They're going to continue to hold the government not just to account. They want to know if it's okay for them to ride their bikes, if it's okay for them to use their e-bikes in their community. And are the retailers now going to be, they're in limbo, but are they going to be in trouble for selling something that is deemed illegal? Are the police now responsible for driving around with micrometers to measure wheel size? This was problematic heading into committee. Committee was disappointing. The canned messaging that we heard from the government over and over did not indicate that there is that specific understanding. We've missed our opportunity to amend statute, and I hear the minister when she just said something about there being 3 types of amendments: those that they disagree that it was needed, fine, they're the government, they can disagree; those that can be left to regulation; and that third column or third category of some amendments that we proposed that require more study and consultations. Well, that's all well and good, but the time has passed, right? The time has passed for amending statute, and so that's frustrating and disappointing. But, Speaker, this bill also, of course, deals with towing and storage, safety and enforcement. Everyone in this House has heard local stories or has read the paper or seen on TV. Has been a chaotic, I'll say system loosely, for towing and storage. What we have here, Speaker, is enabling legislation, which is important, but the regulations could still be years away, right? So it remains to be seen whether we see an improvement in safety on our roads when it comes to towing and when that will happen. So those are reassurances we'd like from the government, as not just as debate continues, but as we have the opportunity to hear from them on those regulations, whether they'll be years away or not. So.
Yes, I apologize for interrupting the member from Oshawa, who will have an opportunity later today to conclude her hour-long lead. But the time for debate in this matter this morning has expired, and it is now time for member statements.
I recognize the member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And that applause was effusive and unnecessary, but appreciated. I am very pleased, Speaker, to have this opportunity to stand in this legislature as the official opposition critic for infrastructure, transportation and highways, as we are debating for third reading, debating Bill 282, the Moving Ontarians More Safely Act, or MOMS Act. And Speaker, what I will start out by saying is this bill has moved at lightning speed through this process. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because I was very disappointed as the critic with things to say, which should surprise no one, with things to say on this bill, that I did not have the opportunity to stand in this House and debate it. Yes, we're on alternating cohorts, but it moved through so quickly and was already in committee after just a couple of days after it had been tabled. And why that's relevant, because oftentimes things, if things we all agree on can move quickly, I'm not concerned about that specifically. But this particular bill has brought to light that many of the community stakeholders interested in e-bikes in Schedule 1 of the bill, interested in e-bikes, were not appropriately consulted at the later stages of the drafting, I'm going to guess. And the government can correct me. They've talked about their extensive stakeholder consultations, but it became very clear that some of the folks, like the e-bike community, are very worried about some of the nitty-gritty specifics in this bill that will potentially make their e-bikes unlawful or their future purchases unlawful. But it creates a bit of a mess, frankly. And we'll talk about that at length. But I'm going to give a bit of an introduction. This bill is 3 schedules. Schedule 1 includes amendments to the Highway Traffic Act. Schedule 2 is really just minor housekeeping with the Metrolinx Act. So that's all I'm going to say on that one, because it is just minor. And Schedule 3 is Towing and Storage Safety and Enforcement Act amendments. I think probably much of the debate in this legislature from the government benches will be around towing and storage, and the need to regulate, need to make changes. We're not arguing with that, and I will be speaking to that later. This is a bill that the broader community understands as addressing stunt driving, as addressing the towing and storage sector. I don't think it was intended to be a controversial bill when it comes to e-bikes. However, we've seen a very enthusiastic and invested community of e-bike users, retailers, and enthusiasts raise a number of important issues. So I have a fair bit of time today, Speaker, to delve into the meat and potatoes of this bill, and I'm going to be glad to take that opportunity because, as I said, I didn't have it before. So, Speaker, in Schedule 1, this broadens the laws against racing and stunt driving, sets lower speed thresholds within municipalities to capture non-highway locations like parking lots. We've heard about why that's important. I think anyone watching today across Ontario that has been on the roadways during this pandemic and this time of, I would say, lesser traffic, has seen that people are taking this opportunity to drive quite dangerously. That whether you call it stunt driving, or I've heard it referred to at committee as extreme driving or something else, people know that they're seeing more and more people make that choice to drive unsafely. We heard at committee some excellent presentations from folks that spoke about sort of the psychology of those who would race on our roadways and endanger folks and families. We've had some suggestions made at committee for the regulatory process and how the government can ensure that this accomplishes what it sets out to do. An important part of the Highway Traffic Act section that is being amended that we've done a lot of work on, we being the official opposition and my colleagues, enables automated camera enforcement to prevent drivers from illegally passing open streetcar doors. And I know that a few of my colleagues have been on record on that issue. Speaker, another section that has been amended by this bill is about dooring. So a section under the Highway Traffic Act relative to dooring. Please. And Speaker, if you're not familiar with dooring, it makes sense when you hear it, but it is when a driver opens a door into the path of a cyclist. And it was very emotional and very powerful during committee to hear from Jessica Speaker, who I will share more of her story, who actually she was not doored, but she was just cycling along, minding her own business, and ended up very lucky to be alive, Speaker. And things can happen so quickly on our roadways, which is why when we were talking about dooring, which we're in agreement that dooring needs to be tracked, okay? And my colleague from Spadina-Fort York had shared with committee and shared with this legislature, and will probably take the opportunity to share during third reading to illustrate the importance of getting this right. He was doored as a cyclist, has done a lot of advocacy work on the topic. But one of the things that we are trying to bring forward, as I will discuss later, is if a cyclist is driving along, or excuse me, cycling along, and a door opens and the cyclist hits it, there's contact, and that is dooring. No one disputes that. But what happens when the door opens and the cyclist is able to have that split second to swerve? Now, if they swerve and there's another, I won't say accident because accidents make it seem random, but another collision or crash, what we want is for that incident, which was started by the door, we want that to also be tracked, because we have not been tracking this. The insurance folks want this tracked. The cyclists want this tracked. You know, we're seeing so much more in the way of rideshare. So think about, this isn't just a driver opening their door anymore. Now it's the passengers on both sides, either side, opening into traffic, opening into cyclists. I have not been on a bike in a lot of years, Speaker, although I was an avid cyclist when I was teaching English for 3 years in Japan. I lived on that bicycle, and I have, at the time, I had halfway decent reflexes, which were really needed there. But I'm a driver on our streets, and I know that the Ubers and the Lyfts and the rideshare cars, they make me very nervous because they spontaneously do things that are not easily anticipated. So now I can imagine being a vulnerable road user on a cyclist without, you know, a steel cage around me. Speaker, a big part of this Schedule 1 redefines power-assisted bicycle to create 3 subclasses of e-bikes that can be independently regulated. So if you think about bicycle style, and picture a bicycle, that's sort of your starting point, bicycle style, moped style, and motorcycle style. I'm going to get into this at length, but suffice it to say, and as we heard from the minister, that the goal of this bill, that the spirit of this legislation was to make the world a better place, was supposed to tidy up, make it clear that e-bikes on our roads would be able to continue on our roads. I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to quote the minister right now, as she, you know, she can do that herself and has, but the e-bike community, I think, expected that to happen with this legislation. But when you get into the weeds of, you know, the specifics, what we found and what we heard over and over at committee, and all of us heard via our emails, our enthusiastic emails, is that instead we being the government has created a mess with some of the specifics. That they've excluded e-bikes that are part of a government pilot for seniors, that just things that seem inadvertent. And they've been, as a community of e-bike users, they've been very generous to this government, I'll say. That's not a criticism. They've been generous by saying, I don't think they meant to do this, Speaker. However, if I've had time, as the official opposition critic, to learn so much about e-bikes that I never knew, more information than I knew I could hold. If I've had the opportunity to learn all of this about e-bikes and work with our opposition research to craft thoughtful, appropriate amendments to solve the problem, then the government had the time to review them, had the time to understand them, because supposedly they already know what's going on about e-bikes, and they had the opportunity to pass them and make sure that this legislation was what it needed to be. That didn't happen. So while the community thinks it was a mistake and inadvertent and, you know, not intentionally creating a mess of things, I'm inclined to disagree at this point, because it was so carefully laid out for them in a nonpartisan way, I will say. You know, like it was, we had all of these amendments, you know, our colleague from Guelph also, you know, it was a time of nonpartisan discussion, and the government each time with each amendment said, oh, well, we vote against, or we recommend voting against. And then the explanation seemed to mirror the same understanding as what went into the legislation, which I would argue was not understanding at all. So, Speaker, as the minister told us that this is the second road safety bill in 3 years, and that, you know, this is not the end of it. Well, what I worry is that this, like Schedule 1 and parts of Schedule 1, are just going to have to come back in another piece of legislation. Like, what a waste of everyone's time. Get it right the first time. So I have concerns about that. You know, and I am going to take the opportunity. I said I wasn't going to quote the minister. I take it back. I totally am. So we've had a couple of days of committee, but it's all happened so quickly that we don't have the transcripts from the clause-by-clause consideration, of course, right? Because everything's just lightning speed through here. However, there are the transcripts from when both ministers, Minister of Transportation, the Associate Minister of Transportation, appeared before committee, and this is what the Minister of Transportation had to say, because I was explaining to her about the e-bikes and that we were all being inundated and that I was certain that all the government members were as well. And she said, quote, "I understand, as you pointed out, that inboxes have been bombarded with pictures of different configurations of e-bikes and that stakeholders and people who own them and want to be able to ride e-bikes have been reaching out to seek further clarification. As I said, we developed these in consultation with stakeholders so we can continue to refine the definition and refine the implementation of cargo e-bikes and their use on our roads and in our municipalities in consultation." I'm going to emphasize this next part. We will absolutely take the feedback that we receive through this committee process, as well as the feedback that the Associate Minister and I are getting, as well as our parliamentary assistant is getting on this proposal, to make sure that it is refined and clear. Well, I don't know whether the folks at committee didn't get that memo, but they did not take anything under advisement at committee, like nothing. In fact, they had the prepared, you know, clause by clause as we went through the amendments. You know, they were ready. They weren't interested in what we had to say. You know, suffice it to say, they may have listened to the presenters, but at some point, somebody decided that they were not going to take any of those amendments at this time. Yes, and the minister went on to say later, she said, "I appreciate the feedback that we have been getting and look forward to the opportunity to further refine it if we can." End quote. Disappointingly, we had the opportunity. So, Speaker, for the folks at home, and a reminder maybe to some folks in this room, when a bill is introduced to the legislature, that's first reading. It's tabled, it's introduced, and it is now before the House for some consideration. And as an opposition member, if I table a bill for first reading, the government might pick it up and put it into their, their legislation. That's fine. Second reading is where somebody calls it for debate, that we've committed, this is what we're going to get on the record, we're going to have this debate and see if we can't move that bill forward. So we did that with this bill, 282. We had the second reading debate. Then it went to committee. Here's what's supposed to happen at committee. Committee, you hear from experts and folks, then you propose amendments or you don't, and then we come back and we go through the bill literally clause by clause, section by section, and say, okay, here's a suggestion, here's an amendment, here's a tightening of language, whatever, right? Or take this part out. And then the government, in its infinite wisdom, is supposed to adopt the amendments that fit the bill to make sure it is the best version of best piece of legislation it can be. Here's the part, Speaker, that I'm going to put sort of like an asterisk beside, if I kind of can. When that bill goes through clause by clause and we make the changes, then the text of the bill stands. The text, when it is referred back to this House, this chamber in which we are all sitting right now, when it is referred back to this House for third reading, which is what we're doing today, there's no more amending statute. You can't change the text, the statute, you can't change the bill itself. You can do whatever, you being the government, sorry, the government can do whatever they want in regulations, right? But they can't, in regulation, go back and change the text of the statute. So it passed through clause by clause, came out the other side completely unamended. Like all amendments that we put forward, the independents put forward, we were just talking to hear ourselves, Speaker. They had decided they were having none of it. Not a single one of those amendments passed. It comes out the other side exactly verbatim to what went into committee. So once this passes, I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know what they're going to tell the e-bike folks. So anyway, that's kind of what's happened. And now here we are at third reading. But actually, you know what, Speaker? I'm going to take the opportunity. I am going to go through committee. And it's going to be a barn burner. But I'm going to go through clause by clause and highlight what was missed by this government, the missed opportunities. But before I do that, I'm going to throw a wrinkle into this, if I can find it in all my paperwork here. Okay. Speaker, you can call me lots of things, but you'll not be able to call me unprepared today. So, Speaker, on May 14th, so May 14th was the clause-by-clause consideration of Bill 282. Hold that date in your mind, May 14th. On May 12th, the government posted a power-assisted bicycle or e-bike redefinition proposal to the regulatory registry for a 30-day consultation. Okay? So the proposal for this 30-day consultation, like a public consultation, is connected to Bill 282. It's on power-assisted bicycle or e-bike redefinition. Okay, so this proposal that they've now put out there on the Environmental Registry of Ontario has a 30-day consultation period. They introduced that on the 12th. We were at clause by clause 2 days later, which, you know, spoiler alert, is significantly before the June 10th end of 30-day consultation period. So what I want to know is, and I don't know that you can answer this, but how can the government claim it is consulting in good faith when the deadline for submitting comments is June 10th and when the text of the bill was finalized on May 14th? So the new Environmental Registry, or ERO, posting says, quote, "Due to the proposal being updated, the ministry has decided to post the updated proposal for a period of 30 days to gather feedback," end quote. We're talking about e-bike stuff, and yet there we were in committee. So I raised this at committee, and it's like, and we had to take a recess. We got some input, but the input that we need is actually from the Auditor General, so we didn't get the answer that day. But I want to know how the government can meet its statutory requirement of considering this input prior to a decision, when the decision will have been made nearly a month before the end of the feedback period. Like, that's a fair question. Because I wanted to know if it was even in order for us to have clause-by-clause consideration of the bill before the 30-day comment period is over. And I wonder if we will find out that the government has once again been violating the Environmental Bill of Rights. So not something I can answer today. I guess we'll have to let this all play out. But if the government felt that there was need to get community feedback on e-bike redefinition, right? Power-assisted bicycle e-bike redefinition proposal. If they felt the need to get, community input, why wouldn't they have thought of that before the bill made it to clause by clause? Or before the bill was tabled? Like, I got an email at some point on Sunday, I think it was like Sunday evening, inviting me as critic to a briefing. Okay, well, we didn't get that email till Monday, but then the bill was tabled on Monday. We weren't able to make it to the briefing because, surprise, briefing. And then it was Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. that the government started debating the bill that had been tabled the day before, which hadn't even been printed till the day they started debating it. How's that for fair process, right? Fine, we can read it online first thing in the morning. And I wasn't here as critic, so I appreciate that the member from Timiskaming and Cochrane had to get up and give an hour on transportation issues. But none of us were able to have the bill in our hands. And then it was done and referred to organization for committee by Thursday. That's how quick. So now you want to do a 30-day consultation. After, what's the expression the Premier likes? The ship has left the dock? The ship has left the dock. Okay. Order.
Please.
Okay. I did not say anything inappropriate. If that's okay. I heard it. So, Speaker, I'm going to regain some semblance of control in my self here and continue on. Speaker, my point being, 30 days of consultation is probably warranted. The timing is not appropriate. The timing should have come before this bill came to this legislature. And I don't know if anyone in this House can dispute that with the amount of blowback, so to speak, that they're seeing in their inboxes, that we're all seeing in our inboxes. So before I get into the committee stuff, no, I will. Let's just do that. Let's get into committee. So, Speaker, this morning, the Minister of Transportation made comments on this bill, and one of the things that she had said, and again, I can't quote exactly, but my takeaway was that there were many amendments. I think that she actually said that they were thoughtful amendments, and that they sort of fell into 3 categories, as per the ministry. That one was a category of amendments that we had proposed that they didn't support, that they didn't think had merit. That's their right to think so. I think they're wrong, but that's fine. That's fair. The second category being amendments that they could deal with in regulation, that they felt we were proposing amendments that could be solved or sorted out in regulation. Maybe, and I hope so, frankly. And the third category, she said, some require more study and consultations. I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, Speaker. If I, who am not an e-bike expert, if I and research had time to meet with folks from across the e-bike world, if we had a chance to meet with them, have full understanding, and come up with extremely precise, careful, exact, and appropriate amendments, then they had time to consider them. They also had time to do those same consultations, because while we're talking with the folks, they weren't, right? Not until right up the, before the day before committee. Like, come on. This bill is supposed to be and is about road safety, and we support many of the initiatives in it. We support the goal of, appropriately classifying e-bikes. We wanted clarity, just like the government and just like the e-bike users and retailers, right? Unfortunately, that's not where we are, and so this is what we're going to talk about. So we had a number of presenters at committee. I will say that from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, we heard about towing. They did have an important, suggestion that is, as they put it, we have a number of ideas that we're going to share with the government. If there's anything that's going to be done sooner rather than later, it would be the Repair and Storage Liens Act. They talked to us about possessory lien and the fact that you can't, quote, there's no cap once they've kidnapped your car and there's a negligible enforcement. It's incentivizing the kidnapping of the car, and then the legal system gums things up, and there's a lack of enforcement as well, end quote. We heard some specific things about towing. So while people are in favor, ourselves included, of regulating the towing and storage world, because we all can turn on the nightly news or see things in our local papers that are terrifying, frankly, that we see it has been essentially the Wild West for a long time. By the way, the last government kind of tinkered around the edges of this. They had a bill that didn't accomplish what this bill is setting out to do. Interestingly, it was Stephen Del Duca that was the Minister of Transportation for a really long time. So why it wasn't fixed, I don't know. It's a great question. I'm not the only one asking it. However, here we are with this one, and this bill, I will say that what we heard at committee about the towing and storage safety and enforcement section, people are supportive. But I will remind everyone in this House and the folks at home that this is enabling legislation. And what that means is it enables something. It doesn't fix it necessarily. It enables that process, and we will keep eyes on it to hope that these regulations won't be years away, but they could be, right? So when we're talking about the safety concerns, when we think about the stuff going on out in with towing and storage, we know that the fix could still be years away. So we encourage the government to stay the course and continue to work on this, and to be forthcoming with community partners to make sure that indeed it doesn't just reflect the spirit of what was intended, that it changes the safety of our communities. Thank you. So I had stories to share about towing. I'm not going to. I think we all know that that there is a need, and I'm glad to see that in this bill. We did hear. We heard a lot of folks who were concerned about stunt driving. And like I said, the layperson who is out on the roads can see that people are driving faster, that you see unsafe behavior. We're seeing things on our roads that need to be addressed. So anyone that I have met with in my capacity as critic has been, of course, supportive of this legislation, that section of it, and they've also been very helpful in making some suggestions to the government in terms of actually implementing penalties. There has been no change. I mean, we're talking about stunt driving, we're talking about excessive speeds, but there has been no change to the penalties or to the fines for speeding in something like 30 years, as we heard, right? So there are things that the government can look at, as were suggested at committee. So let's see. Speaker, this is my amendment packet. And I won't read all of it, but there was a lot. There was a lot. So I'm going to just go through what we did recommend as the official opposition at committee. Again, we wanted to establish 3 classes of bicycle-style e-bike. There were issues raised at committee about the government accidentally excluding bikes that they were including in a cycling without age program. So the bikes that they're paying for, or that they're highlighting, they're wanting to have seniors use. On the one hand, they're excluding with the other, and that's a perfect example of left hand, right hand, not knowing what the other is doing. And when that was raised at committee, again, it was defeated. So, little things like the word conventional. So what is a conventional e-bike, Speaker? If I asked you to draw me a picture of a conventional fork and frame e-bike, I don't know if you'd know where to start, and I don't know if your drawing would look the same as my drawing. So it was a small thing, but it was about being consistent with language to get rid of the word consistent. What other words could you use? Traditional, likable, nice looking. They were talking about being consistent with other jurisdictions and not using arbitrary language. And to the industry, they were suggesting that this was arbitrary language. But again, the government said, we disagree and we recommend to vote against. So they did. Wheels. This is so strange. So, Speaker, again, if I asked you to draw a picture of a wheel, I don't know why I'm picking on you. What I'm going to say is I'm going to focus on this specific issue. Many folks are concerned that their e-bikes that they currently are loving, that their wheels may actually fall outside of what's allowed. So diameter or width or what have you. And we're not even sure if the government defines wheel as being the rim or the rim plus tire. And that makes a difference. So again, we were seeking to have things clarified, because the letters that we've been getting from e-bike folks really illustrated the fact, like we heard from the London Bicycle Cafe, Ben Coey and Eric Kampoff, they were saying that, quote, while some of the changes bring much needed clarity, we have concerns that Bill 282 unintentionally bans products that are already used safely every day in our province by families, municipalities, corporations, and even organizations funded by the provincial government. So they gave us a table, and I am a former educator, And I love tables. It was so clear. And what they've outlined is what they view as they said, unintended consequences of the regulatory framework. And Speaker, this table was awesome. So it basically outlined what is currently written in the bill, what they think the government was setting out to achieve, the unintended consequences, as they generously put it, but the consequences, and they suggested exactly what needs to be fixed. Now, our research team worked with them and we fine-tuned that to make sure that it fit with legislation, but it was a lot of stuff about technical specifications that would exclude bikes. As I mentioned, a conventional, that word provides a wide set of interpretations. Wheel, I've already mentioned that, but we're not sure whether, now that it's passed, we're not sure if what police and bylaw are going to be having to go around with micrometers, and I don't think that they're probably going to do that. But that shouldn't be what the government is trusting, like, oh, okay, it's a mess, but just leave it alone. I'm sure the police have better things to do than measure wheels. Well, maybe, but what parent that puts their kid in an e-bike, or what grandmother who is using it for, shopping and groceries, which user of an e-bike wants to know in the back of their mind that technically what they've got is not legal? That doesn't fit. Speaker, the London Bicycle Cafe folks also said that it excludes many family cycles manufactured by global brands that have stringent requirements in the world, and they were talking about the Cycling Without Age program for seniors that was financed by this government. The cargo trikes basically have been purchased by the City of Toronto, fleet of trikes employed by FedEx. Are all of those not okay now? So yeah, it is a question, and it's a question that a lot of a lot of people have been writing to our office to seek that clarity. I have Lynn here from Toronto Centre who said, I understand that amendments are being made to the Highway Traffic Act, which I generally support, but I'm concerned that my not yet arrived Brompton Electric does not meet the definition in the legislation that was introduced. Brompton bikes have smaller wheels than full-size bikes, and I believe they're narrower than the 35mm referenced in the legislation. So she said, I'm not sure what the legal effect will be if the Brompton Electric has wheels narrower. I hope that the legislation can be revised to ensure bikes like the Brompton Electric Brompton fit within the legislation. In my case, it's a matter of mobility, activity, and health. Alan Cheadle recently moved to Brampton, and he said, we love our bike, and so does our 3-year-old. Without changing some of the wording in this bill, our bike could become illegal. Please help. Chris McCreary from London is worried. He said he wants to make sure that he's, quote, not driving my illegal cargo bike around to move my family and have to go back to driving. Please no. He says, we now use our cargo e-bike as our main mode of transportation, from groceries to taking our daughters to activities, and recently we even took our pets to the vet. We got a lot of these. Like, really neat to learn how people are making sustainable choices and navigating their communities differently and safely. But now they're worried. So Marlene Jones from London says, I want to keep rolling carefree on my e-bicycle. She wrote a beautiful letter, actually, but I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving through this, but I think you take my point, Speaker. Phil Nowotny says, while some of the changes bring much-needed clarity, I have concerns that Bill 282 unintentionally bans products that are already used safely every day in our province by families, municipalities, corporations, and even organizations funded by the provincial government. He is severely concerned and impacted to have such bikes outlawed. He uses his bike to take his toddler to daycare. Are they legal? Are they illegal? And what kind of position does this put, Speaker, what kind of position does this put the retailers in? So if they now know that technically it's not technically allowed, whether it's going to be an offence that the police and bylaw folks are chasing them down for or not, and they sell these products, is there a liability question there for the retailers? And will someone buy those bikes? Will they not? Will the global distributors actually look at Ontario and say, yes, I feel like I want to continue to do business with you? We heard really cool presentations about tourism and recovery, and these cargo e-bikes being used by businesses locally. Really neat stuff. And I applaud the e-bike folks because they sent so many photos that were illustrative of what they were explaining. To see these really cool cargo bikes, and then to know that maybe because of the wheel width or what have you, that they're technically not going to be allowed. I don't know. Is the government just hoping that the police and bylaw folks just won't care? Because that's not really, I wouldn't say that's good governance, frankly. Other things about gross vehicle weight versus cycle weight. I'm in the weeds here. Here was one. So with the weight, and there was a lot of discussion about the weight of bikes, and I got a little tangled in it, frankly, but the concept is the larger bikes that might actually have more people to help with, like seniors with disabilities or folks that need a companion on them to help them cycle. Some of the pedal assist or some of the e-bikes that have different pedals with the hands. There's all sorts of different things to factor in, the cargo capacity and whatnot. Some of those bikes are fairly heavy. That doesn't mean they go fast, right? So in terms of weight, other jurisdictions have no maximum weight. So the government didn't like our amendments about weight, but we had one that kept their same weight. And I'm going to tell this story because even though it's really in the weeds, Speaker, it was just, it really makes the point of what we were dealing with, which was like the twilight zone. So we kept the same language to keep the 55 kilogram cycle weight standard that they had set out. But what we said, we added the words, or the prescribed maximum, or the prescribed maximum. Okay, why this matters is we said, okay, keep what you've got, but add in those 4 little words that allow you to go back when you realize that you've mucked it up entirely, that will allow you to go back and be really grateful that you passed this amendment because you can up the maximum when you realize finally what that means. And we were arguing, like, take this power. We are giving the government, a majority government, we're saying, take these words, use them wisely, but be glad to have them because we're happy to do your job for you in this regard. And the government was like, no, thank you, we don't want more power. And I was like, it didn't make any sense to me because after the 30-day consultation that we've got going on the side now, the may or may not be in violation of the Environmental Bill of Rights. But after those 30 days, they're going to be like, oh, no, we can't go back and amend statute. Sure wish that we had passed that NDP Amendment 6, but they didn't. Walk assist is another thing that if I'm walking with my bike, Speaker, and maybe I shouldn't act this out, but if we're walking alongside an e-bike, it helps to have something called walk assist, which allows me to, it will sort of propel itself at my speed so that I'm not dragging this e-bike. So we wanted to make sure that that would actually be included in this legislation because it's, you're not pedaling it when you're walking with it. Again, no clarity, no clarity. Focusing a lot on e-bikes. I'll keep moving through. And this is the thing, is I don't think the government saw this coming because whoever wrote it, I think, thinks that they understood it, but it became very clear from stakeholders that there wasn't understanding. Now, Speaker, something else we tried to include was the Teach the Reach Act. So my colleague from Davenport had introduced Bill 89, the Teach the Reach Act about the Dutch Reach, and that is a safer way of opening the door, and well, it's a safer way of opening the driver's side door so that you don't fling your door open into traffic and end up harming someone who's on a cycle. However, that was not something that was a priority in this legislation. If it had been, it could have been in here. The government talked at committee about education, the need for education. That is literally what the bill is about, is including that in driver education. But no. Speaker, we tried to include the Protecting Vulnerable Road Users Act, which is Bill 62, as introduced by my colleague from University Rosedale. And we had a number of presenters from the Ontario Brain Injury Association and others who came and said that the need for a Vulnerable Road Users Act was immense. The Ontario Brain Injury Association said, quote, we are also supportive of Bill 62, which is the Vulnerable Road Users Bill. We encourage you to consider utilizing the Vulnerable Road Users Bill to further strengthen Bill 282 to protect all vulnerable road users. Again, because we see the impact. We see the lifelong impact of those who are injured. Because, Speaker, a meaningful Vulnerable Road Users Act doesn't just set out who is vulnerable on our roads, whether it's construction workers, whether it's cyclists, pedestrians, those who are vulnerable as they're using our roads. But it also incorporates the need for victim impact statements in the event of something awful happening, right? That there is a requirement for people who have endangered a vulnerable road user to have meaningful consequences. But again, this government said no. We heard from Jessica Speaker and Heather Sim, who are part of the Friends and Families for Safe Streets, which is a coalition of people who, as they said, is a group of people whose loved ones were suddenly, senselessly and violently killed by drivers in a collision on Ontario's deadly streets, or people like me who survived a crash with severe injuries. And that's from Jessica Speaker. They were advocating for the incorporation of Bill 62, and they told their very personal, very important stories about injuries and loss. Jessica Speaker told us about her collision in 2015 when she was riding her bike to work in a straight line, when an oncoming driver made a left turn and slammed her large SUV into her. And Speaker, as she explained it, well, here's what she said. Quote, "When she struck me, she broke my spine, she inflicted a brain injury, and she did such extensive damage to the side of my body that I developed a large blood clot in my leg. Later, a piece of that blood clot broke off, chewed through my heart, and landed across both lobes of my lungs. In effect, her actions nearly killed me twice." And Speaker, she went on to explain that nothing happened to that driver, right? She continued driving. That we don't have the protections that we would need, that there wasn't the opportunity for a victim impact statement or something like that that would be meaningful and probably correcting or, and the opportunity to retrain in correcting that kind of driving behavior. Heather Sim also asked for the contents of Bill 62 to be incorporated. And she said, quote, "I'm Heather. I'm the daughter of Gary Sim. On June 30th of 2017, my dad was riding his bike home from running errands. His bike was the preferred mode of transportation for him in the city. He was riding straight past a plaza when a driver in a van drove up behind him, passed him, and turned right into him. He spent 2 days on life support before he died." We were grateful for their stories, but they were hard to hear, understandably. And we heard many others from other presenters who shared on behalf of their organizations that are supporting those who are grieving or are recovering. Heather also said, "For my dad's case, the driver was charged with turn not in safety. He was found guilty and given the maximum fine of $500 and 2 demerit points. There was no license suspension. At sentencing, the judge called a recess to determine if she could increase the fine, as she felt this was not sufficient. But unfortunately, her hands were tied by the Highway Traffic Act. My dad's life was worth so much more than $500. Speaker, I'm going to use that to tell you a bit about another amendment that we brought forward. So we brought forward the amendment to introduce Bill 62. It was defeated. But we also brought in an amendment to introduce Bill 122. And Speaker, that's mine. That's my bill. That's a bill that my colleague from Niagara Falls tabled back in 2015 at the behest of many motorcyclists across the province at the Bikers' Rights Organization. Jerry Rhodes has been an excellent voice for them, and I was glad to table the bill as critic for transportation and highways. But it's called the Fairness for Road Users Act. And Heather's story about her father and the judge calling a recess, actually, as I recall, to try and find out if she could do more, could levy more than a $500 fine. And she could not. So currently, a person convicted of contravening the Highway Traffic Act for minor driving offences, such as an unsafe left turn or failing to stop at a stop sign, receives a small fine in the range of approximately $100 to $1,000, regardless of the extent of physical damage to the victim. Regardless. So what happens is you have insult to injury, that if a family is grieving their loved one and they're sitting in that courtroom, the most that can happen is whatever the fine is for failure to stop at a stop sign, or a, quote, lesser infraction of the Highway Traffic Act. You tell someone who's lost a loved one that it was a lesser infraction. So the government's answer to that, when we were trying to introduce my bill, which increases penalties, increases penalties to be in line with careless driving. So it increases the fine, so from either $2,000 to $50,000, imprisonment, license or permit suspended. That's not saying that those things will happen. What it's saying is it gives the judge the opportunity that if someone dies or if someone suffers serious bodily harm, that it gives them options. That the judge can consider, is this a first-time offense? Is this person a menace on the roads? They can make that determination. That's what it does. It is not setting a set amount for if someone dies. It is allowing a judge to use their discretion, which we heard over and over is missing. And when the government answers back, and this is, you know, like they kept talking about their careless driving, you know, the penalty for careless driving. And I realize it's a massive penalty and all of that, but Speaker, I don't remember if it was 83% in this regard, but hardly any people who are charged with careless driving are sentenced with that. They're not. They plead down is what happens. So if it's careless driving as the charge, it doesn't stick because they plead down and it ends up being an improper left turn or what have you. And then we end up back with if it's $500 fine. So it is gut-wrenching for families. Bill 122, we really were hoping that people, or that the government would understand and would incorporate this. Let's see. I wanted to get, Jerry Rhodes has been a phenomenal voice for this. And he has said far too many road users die or become seriously injured as a result of a, quote, lesser infraction of the Highway Traffic Act, and the penalty available is only $500 as per Section 214 General Penalty Clause. He says, the Premier of Ontario is on record as having stated he would like to lock up killer drivers and throw away the key. That was a newscast in June of 2020, and that was about a situation of a young mother and her 3 very young daughters killed by an irresponsible driver. It was not the same situation, Speaker, but as he said, quote, he indicated he wanted action from the federal government on such a situation. That accident involved a criminal code violation. However, the vast majority of accidents involve Highway Traffic Act violations. He said that he and his caucus have the ability to help make the Highway Traffic Act provide justice in tragedies with the legislation proposed in Bill 122. And he said Bill 282 should be amended to provide for stiffer, more just penalties to deter all infractions of the Highway Traffic Act that could result in fatalities or serious disabling injuries. But, Speaker, they said no. Gosh, there's so many. There were a lot of pages. We did a lot of work. We did a lot of meaningful work on behalf of folks who took the time to reach out, and it's disheartening when it's not even, it's not just that it's not passed, it wasn't respected, I'll say. Maybe they'll argue that, but anyway. We talked about dooring, that we want the police to be obliged to record all dooring incidents. In this case, the term is dooring accident. But even if there is no contact, right? So if a driver opens the door and somebody has to swerve around and it creates, you know, a crash or what have you, we want the police to also record this incident as dooring. And Speaker, we're not coming up with something random there. This is actually to keep language. It would align with the Section 165 of the Highway Traffic Act. So it's the government's legislation that has changed the definition and isn't consistent with Section 165. The government wants to read my notes. I'm happy to share. There's a lot. And Speaker, I see that I'm basically out of time. So I've covered much of what we talked about in committee. My colleague from Mushkegowuk, James Bay, had brought forward a thoughtful motion about trucks on the roads. The government supported it at that time. We want to see that move forward. Transportation enforcement officers. That is a conversation that we need to have. They are tasked with doing unbelievable work on the roads with our transport trucks, and they're not being respected by this government. They're not being compensated fairly. But in this act, they're given more responsibility. Like, that's not right or fair. You need to work with them. They've got, as they put it, a bureaucratic roadblock that needs to be straightened out by the ministries. Other issues that we heard about, the speed pilot, and I could talk for days about the speed pilot. So on the one hand, the government is saying no stunt driving, and on the other hand, they're wanting to increase the speed limit. So, Speaker, there's still a lot of work to be done to keep our roadways safe. I am sure that my colleagues are going to talk about the need to incorporate winter road maintenance strategies and improvements in legislation. We also heard that the term accident is not an appropriate word. It's a collision. This government has a lot of work to do, and I'm very pleased to be on record. Thank you, Speaker.
I thank the member from Oshawa for completing her hour-long lead as the critic for transportation, and now your colleagues on both sides of the House will have an opportunity to ask you questions about your presentation. The first question goes to the member from Whitby.
Thank you, Speaker, and good afternoon, and thanks to the member for Oshawa for her presentation. The Moving Ontarians More Safety Act 2021, Speaker, proposes the Towing and Storage Safety Enforcement Act, which requires tow truck operators, drivers, and vehicle storage operators to have a provincial certificate to operate. It also proposes vehicle and equipment requirements for tow trucks and providing protections for persons requesting or receiving towing and storage services. Does the member from Oshawa agree with the steps outlined to combat the fraud and criminal activity seen and experienced by many in the towing industry?
And we return to the member from Oshawa for her response.
Thank you, Speaker. And a number of the pieces in this, as I said, enabling legislation in Section 3 or in Schedule 3 are important, and we've heard from the insurance industry, we've heard from safety advocates, and we recognize that they are what is needed at this time. What actually ends up coming out of regulations, as I said, that can still be years away, but we'll keep an eye on that because, the devil's in the details. I do believe that we all want our roads to be safer, and that's an important thing. I think that, as we heard from CAA, who do, are reputable towing folks, that they had specifics that they'd like the government to consider when it comes to licensing and different jurisdictions and municipalities and whatnot, and not creating an accidental patchwork
10 seconds.
That actually creates a new problem where we're seeking to solve them. So, yes, I support regulating, but let's be super thoughtful.
Thank you. The next question, the member from Algoma, Manitoulin.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank the member from Oshawa for her presentation, very detailed. Something that might be a surprise to her is last summer I got my GM license, and one of the reasons why I got that, it was a lifelong dream, a childhood dream of having seen my dad on a bike for a very long time. And I tell you, there was nothing like getting on that bike and feeling my dad with me there. It's the closest I've ever been. I lost my dad when I was quite young, but it also provided me with a new opportunity of having a different vision of our roads. The training that you go through to getting your GM license is second to none. It really lights you up. It makes you aware of your surroundings and what's out there. And the term dooring became very evident to me. I've always enjoyed my conversations that I've had with Mr. Jerry Rhodes, who's the president or the provincial government liaison officer for the bikers' rights organizations, and they've made a very good presentation to the committee on dooring. Can you please explain to us why it is important to expand the regulations under dooring?
Thank you. Back to the member from Oshawa.
The work of the bikers' rights organization obviously deals with safety on the roadways, and I mean I have worked with them for a few years now, not on the issue of dooring, but on the issue of my Bill 122 that would say that if something were to happen and someone was injured or killed, that there are stiffer penalties. But certainly anybody riding a bike, a motorcycle, is very concerned about issues like dooring, and they want that to be tracked, and that was certainly something we heard. Also, Mark Andrews came before committee, and I didn't have a chance to highlight his stuff, but what a resonant voice at committee. He's a retired police officer who served 32 years with the OPP and finished his career the last 15 years as a traffic inspector for northeastern Ontario.
Response.
And he very clearly outlined the need for different strategies to keep cyclists, bicyclists, or motorcycles, cars, everybody safe.
Thank you. The next question, a member from Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Speaker. My question for the member is, she stated, she used to work in Japan, and she was an avid cyclist, and now, of course, she drives to work, and so that is a good example of how governments need to be nimble. They need to consider, the laws that protect our people who decide to drive a bicycle, and those who decide to drive a bike, and those who decide to take public transit. And you'd say that, all the tools that the government can possibly have are good tools. So my question is, when I spoke to my local police force, I have two, but I'll reference South Simcoe Police, I constantly get their news releases about stunt driving and enforcement. And so right now, yes, there's things they can do, but they need more from the government. And so don't you think it's beholden on the government to give our police enforcement as many tools as they can to use to enforce these rules? Thank you.
Back to the member from Oshawa.
I very much appreciate the question. I would like to continue to share some of the words from Mark Andrews, who, as I said, served 32 years with the OPP, but 15 years as a traffic inspector, and the things that he saw, I cannot imagine. But he said, quote, "The reality is the folks who do this," sorry, and he's referring to stunt driving, "the people who have that behavior, who are going to take risks, be it stunt driving, be it impaired driving. I've dealt with people who've had 10 and 12 charges and arrests for impaired driving. That's when they've been caught, not including all the times they were never caught. Does the MTO have all the information they need? It's overloaded. There are close to 100,000 people driving in this province right now that the MTO know about who are suspended. There's not enough of us out there to stop them. We have to think of a different way. There are so many exemptions, and there is fear about people who, about charging the owner of a vehicle." He goes on. He had very thoughtful suggestions that were really specific to policing and safety on the roadways. I would encourage the government to take a look.
The next question, the member from London West.
Thank you very much. I want to thank my colleague, the member from Oshawa, for her work on this bill and for her comments today. And in particular, I appreciated her recognition of Ben Cowie and the London Bicycle Cafe for the detail that they provided to the committee on the unintended consequences of the bill and fixes that could be made to address those unintended consequences. London, of course, is one of the communities that has declared a climate emergency. We are also committed to Vision Zero principles. So we have a great interest in allowing e-bikes, and the London Bicycle Cafe has pointed to the increased sales that they are experiencing. What does it mean for a business like the London Bicycle Cafe when the bikes that they are selling to an eager customer base are suddenly illegal because of legislation that has been passed?
Back to the member from Oshawa.
Thank you, and I don't have an answer to that because I'm wondering the same thing. They're wondering the same thing. Certainly, we heard from the London Bicycle Cafe folks. We heard from Bike Law Canada. There are a lot of specific questions being raised about what it will mean for those who use and enjoy e-bikes and whether or not they'll be in violation of the law and what that means for them. But yes, on the retailer side, they're now in this weird limbo. Do they or don't they? So if they sell something that they believe to be unlawful according to this legislation, do they do it anyway? Are they in trouble? Are they liable? What if something happens? Like I keep saying we. This House is creating problems with the government at the helm. And this is unfortunate because how they interpret it, are we just crossing our fingers that the police and bylaw those enforcing it will not interpret it the same way? So this kind of limbo, I think that the government owes the industry clarity. They've certainly worked hard enough demanding it.
Thank you. The next question, the member from Scarborough Rouge Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member from Oshawa for her presentation. At present, we have bicycle style, moped style, motorcycle style. All these e-bikes are all captured within a single e-bike class. The federal definition of e-bike has been repealed on February 19, 2021. The MOMS Act uses this opportunity to redefine e-bike in our province by distinguishing the requirements for moped style, bicycle style, and motorcycle style e-bikes. And municipalities will choose which classes of e-bikes to permit on their infrastructure and which will enhance safety and mobility. Does the member opposite agree that municipalities are in the best position to decide which e-bikes to have on their roads? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The member from Oshawa to respond to her final question.
Thanks very much. And Speaker, the member opposite who serves as the parliamentary assistant was the only voice on any of these issues at committee. He was the only voice at committee. None of the government members spoke, save the member from Durham, who we actually had quite a good conversation about Bill 122. I'm frustrated that this government really brought forward, didn't accept any of the amendments. What the e-bike folks are looking for is harmonization with existing markets. There are opportunities for entrepreneurship, innovation, tourism, pieces of our recovery. What does the member opposite think about that? Why wasn't that factored in? Thank you.
Thank you. Further debate?